Welcome to Evening Upstairs series. Tonight's program will focus on a brief history of Native American removal, discussion of the removal issue during Jackson's presidency, and an explanation of the events that led to the Trail of Tears. Our speaker earned his B.S. from Campbell University, an M.A. from North Carolina State University, and a Ph.D. from Mississippi State University. He's known for his works, Francis Butler Simpkins, A Life, Interpreting American History, The Age of Andrew Jackson, and William Archibald Dunning, Flawed Colossus of American Letters. Let's welcome our guest, Dr. James Humphreys, as he presents Andrew Jackson, Native American Removal and the Trail of Tears.
All right, thank you very much. This is a really great crowd, and I appreciate you braving the bad weather. Not that we haven't had enough. To come out tonight to hear this talk. Andrew Jackson, Native American Removal and the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson's name is inextricably linked to the removal of Native Americans from the Southeast. Even though every president before Jackson thought about how to deal with these Native American groups, what would become known as the 5 civilized tribes. They had some different policies, and these policies really culminated under Jackson. So Jackson's not the first president, to deal with Native Americans. And in the U.S. Constitution, it reads that the national government would have the power to carry on relations with the Native Americans. But as I said, the policy culminates under Andrew Jackson. And you know that Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson were the founders of the Democratic Party. And the Democrats have their Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. And we're entering a political season for the next 3 years in Kentucky. It's going to be some very intense politics. And except for the term, Jefferson and Jackson Day dinners, you won't hear Andrew Jackson mentioned much in speeches or at political rallies. He was considered a great president for his time, but Jackson does not play all that well in the modern world. I guess that's what happens when you get in a gunfight in Nashville and you kill a man in Logan County, Kentucky, in a duel. When Jackson was inaugurated president, he had 2 bullets in him, one near his shoulder from this gun battle in Nashville, and then he had one in this upper area. Jackson would sometimes even spit up blood, but he was one of the physically toughest people you would ever find. But he doesn't play well in the modern world, and one reason is not just his fiery temper. Some people want to say, "Oh, he was crazy." No, he wasn't. He wasn't crazy. He was fiery. Jackson could be very calculating and could compromise when he wanted to. But you won't hear Jackson mentioned a lot by politicians today. And he may even be removed from the $20 bill. And Indian removal, as I'm sure you know, plays a large role in the decline of Jackson's reputation. When Jackson was elected president in 1828, became president in 1829, he invited his friend Ralph Earl, who was a painter, to go to Washington with him. I think he was very lonely because his wife, Rachel, had died a few months earlier, not long after he was elected president. And this just crushed Jackson. He thought possibly about not even going to Washington. He was so crushed at her death, but he did, and Ralph Earl went with him. And Earl has left us paintings of Jackson that give us different images of this complex man, like most presidents. Most presidents are complex people. And Jackson may not have come across as complex, but he was. And here are some of Earl's paintings. You see Jackson, the country squire, the gentleman farmer. Jackson was a slaveholder, had a large home called the Hermitage. He was a very good farmer, made a lot of money off of cotton. You may have been to the Hermitage on Highway 40 east of Nashville. If you haven't, Oh, it's a great place. I could go there every year. It's a great historic site. And if you haven't been there, you ought to take the time to go there. And here you see the horse, a hermitage in the background. You see this pastoral setting, Jackson, the southern gentleman, country squire, the country farmer. And here is his wife, Rachel. And what's kind of interesting about this is he may have married Rachel twice. Once in 1791 in Natchez, possibly. And then several years later, he went through another ceremony with Rachel. And that is because she probably was not, technically she was not divorced from her first husband. And when they married, the divorce was not finalized. Jackson probably should have checked this out, and he really didn't. And she was charged by her first husband, who was not a good husband. They did not love each other. She really loved Jackson. They had a good marriage, but it didn't start off well. And his political opponents never let him forget it. And this became a major issue in his campaigns, that they had committed adultery. And it was very scandalous for a woman to divorce at that time. And in court, Rachel was charged with adultery. So this was a messy situation. And this would hound Jackson for a long time. Here's a picture of the Hermitage. Much of what is there today belonged to Jackson. It's a great place to go. Here is Jackson, the military officer. Here you see him in his uniform. Here you see him on his horse. And where was Jackson's greatest military victory?
Battle of New Orleans.
Okay, the Battle of New Orleans. That's right. The Battle of New Orleans. Gave Johnny Horton a good song.
Yeah.
What?
I had family with him down there.
Okay, all right. He also defeated the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which was the worst defeat that the Native Americans suffered at the hands of U.S. troops. And we may talk about that some, but here's Jackson again, the military man. And you see him in his uniform. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 145 pounds. And when he was young, he got a lot of jokes because he was so skinny. He also had a neurological disorder that made him drool. He lost his brother and his mother in the American Revolution. His father died before he was born. He was virtually alone at about age 16. Migrated out to Tennessee he was born in South Carolina, but moved over to North Carolina and then migrated out to Tennessee. He became a judge, became a lawyer. He was not an extremely studious man, but he studied enough to be a pretty good judge and lawyer. And back in North Carolina, when they heard he had become president, they said, "My gosh, how did that man become president?" Because Thomas Jefferson saw him on the floor of the Senate when he was a senator, and he would get so worked up that spit would fly from his mouth. He couldn't even finish his, I don't think this neurological disorder, afflicted him as an adult. But he couldn't, Jefferson said, "This man can never be president, my gosh." But there was something much more, there was a calmer side, a calculating side to Jackson also. Here you see Jackson, the lawyer, the judge. You see a law book there on the table and the pillars that look like a courtroom. And as I said, Jackson was a hardworking judge in Tennessee, not highly studious, but he certainly learned enough to be a good judge and a good judge and a good lawyer. After he was elected president in 1828, and then reelected by a huge margin in 1832, Jackson, of course, collected his enemies. And a new party sprang up during Jackson's administration, and it was called the Whig Party. And who was one of the great leaders of the Whig Party? Henry Clay from Lexington. What?
I think Lincoln was in that.
Well, that's true. Yeah, Lincoln. The Whigs were the forerunners of the modern day Republican Party. And they really hated Jackson because they thought Jackson was a dictator. They thought he had overstepped his boundaries. They thought that the only opinion that mattered to him was his. When Jackson told his Secretary of the Treasury to remove money from the National Bank, the Whigs got a censure motion in the Senate, the only president to be censored. He destroyed the national banking system. And this is one of my favorite historical cartoons. Andrew Jackson, born to rule, it says. Born to command. A king who possesses as much power as his gracious brother William IV makes a worse use of it. A king who has placed himself above the laws, as he has shown by his contempt of our judges. A king who would destroy our currency. A king born to command, as he has shown himself by appointing men to office contrary to the will of the people. You know, come to think about it, we've never had a president like that, have we? This is the way the Whig Party and Jackson's enemies saw King Andrew, who, as I said, would serve for 2 terms. Let's see. Here you see a picture, pictures of Jackson. He would die in 1845 at the Hermitage. All right. President Jackson, one of the first important laws he signed was in May of 1830. It was called the Indian Removal Act. It authorized the president to negotiate removal treaties with the Indian nations living east of the Mississippi River. It required the government to negotiate treaties fairly, but peacefully and voluntarily. It did not permit the president or anyone else to coerce native nations into giving up their land. And Jackson, as you see through his words here, possibly thought he was doing the right thing. One of them, probably the best biographer of Jackson is Robert Rimini, who's passed away, but Rimini devoted his whole career to writing about Jacksonian America. And Rimini argues, to the dismay of some, that Jackson thought he was doing the right thing, that the Native Americans were going to be destroyed if they were not moved, and that the Native American tribes that are still left were the ones that were removed. The ones that weren't removed didn't fare so well. Rimini argues, again, Rimini was a great historian, but people have really challenged him on this. He argues that this Native American removal policy had the best of intentions, he said. The best of intentions. And so, if you at the Hermitage, I don't know if this is there anymore because they changed the museum. There was an article that Jackson cut out of the newspaper, and the article writer was explaining that the Native Americans were going to be destroyed, their culture undermined and destroyed by the encroachment of whites if they were not moved. And Jackson cut this article out of the paper. You can see some of his writing on the outside of the article. The last time I went to the Hermitage, it was not there, but it was on the wall at the Hermitage. So this is what Jackson said about his removal policy. And remember, other presidents had to deal with this also. Prior to Jackson, go all the way back to Washington, and the idea was that these Native American tribes could become civilized. Washington didn't want the United States looking like a brutish nation, I think. He thought over time that these Native Americans could become, quote, civilized, in the term that whites used, and that the government would provide an Indian agent, would allow missionaries to go into these Native American areas, and would even sell them goods so they would get used to buying and selling goods. They would become consumers. Given the time period, it was a fairly enlightened policy. They did become more like Americans over time, but they never gave up their policy of not selling land, which is what the U.S. government wanted them to do over time. And as you see here, Jackson outlined his Indian removal policy in his second annual message to Congress. The date was December 6, 1830. It gives me great pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages. I underlined these words. Jackson didn't. So he describes this his policy as benevolent, happy consummation, and it really does culminate during Jackson's administration. And that the Native Americans are seeking obvious advantages. Obvious advantages. So possibly Jackson was, being truthful, or at least putting the best face on this policy. Jackson, in 1813, adopted an Indian boy. I don't think Jackson hated Native Americans. Jackson disliked anybody who got in his way and anyone who wanted to thwart the United States. But I don't think his views were any harsher toward Native Americans than most whites at the time. This boy's name was Lindneux. He lived from 1811 to 1828. And Jackson took a strong interest in Lindneux and even thought about sending him to a military academy. But that didn't work out. So Lindneux went to Nashville to learn how to make saddles. And he died from tuberculosis in 1828. So Jackson hopefully wanted to win the respect of Native Americans. Here, the Great Father, about 1830. And I'll be glad to send this whole PowerPoint to anybody who wants, or if you're a teacher, I'll be glad to send all this to you. It's only copyright. It only costs $1,000. No, that's a joke. Okay. Here you see these Native Americans looking up at Jackson, the great white father he wanted to be called. Here's a little Native American in his lap. How condescending can you get? Obviously, this was his enemies' views of Jackson. And there you see, it looks like Columbia there in her dress, stamping on the body and face of a Native American. He wanted to be called the Great Father. The Native Americans called him the Devil. Let's see. Indian Removal Act. Passed the United States Senate 28-19. House of Representatives 102 to 97. The vote in the House, the Indian Removal Act may not have passed without the 3/5 compromise, which was in the Constitution at that time. 3/5 of the slave population of each state was included in the population, and because population determines representation in Congress from each state, then this counting 3/5 of the slave population boosted the number of representatives in Congress from the South. And the vote on the Indian Removal Act was sectional in nature. Representatives from the free states voted against it by a vote of 82 to 41. The slave states voted for it overwhelmingly, 61 to 15. And of course, it's in these slave states that many of these Native Americans live. And so these Southern delegates in the House of Representatives in the House of Representatives staunchly favored the removal of these Native Americans. But there would have been fewer Southerners had 3/5 of the black population not been counted, right? This is one thing Jackson would talk about, how I'm the Democratic spokesman. I believe in democracy. And he didn't say that he won more electoral votes, and he won votes like this because of the 3/5 compromise. All right. So where did these Native Americans live? What groups are we talking about when whites, and I say whites, called them the 5 civilized tribes? Here is a map. I hope you can see that back there. But they live east of the Mississippi River. The Seminole down here in Florida, the Creek in Alabama, Choctaw in the Mississippi Territory, Chickasaw in what is now Tennessee and Mississippi, and then you have then you also have the Cherokee in part of western North Carolina and part of northern Georgia and North Alabama. So you see where these Native Americans are. What we call the Deep South, it was territories, and then between 1812 and 1819, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama all came into the Union. The War of 1812 was fought. Lots of soldiers went into the Deep South, and they saw how good this land was for growing crops. And as I said, 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, all joined the Union between 1812 and 1819 at a time in which the cotton industry was growing and growing and growing. And are these states good for growing cotton? You know, you're darn right. Yes, they're good for growing cotton. There are sugar plantations on the Gulf Coast. Gold's going to be discovered in Georgia. And so this land seems ripe for opportunity for whites. But it's an area, you know, in which there aren't a lot of roads. There's English and French influence. You have these different Native American tribes who now believe that they live independently, but within the parameters of the United States. They live independently as what they consider to be nations, and they're not going to sell their land. They agree to become more like white Americans. We'll talk about that in a moment. But they do not agree to sell their land. And they, as I said, they would become more and more like whites. I don't know if you can see this that well. This is a Chickasaw girl. Like I tell my students, it looks like she's going to the prom. You know, she has the ringlets in her hair and the dress there and the pendant. And this is a Chickasaw girl, one of the Native Americans who was removed during one of these removals. Again, she looks like a young white girl. The Choctaws were the first to face Jackson's policy of removal. The Treaty of Dancing River Creek was designed to force eastern Choctaws off their land, and they were removed over 3 years. The famous Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who wrote Democracy in America, saw the Choctaw on this trail in the wintertime. He wrote, "It was then in the depths of winter, and that year the cold was exceptionally severe. The snow was hard on the ground, and huge masses of ice drifted on the river. The Indians brought their families with them. There were among them the wounded, the sick, the newborn babies, and old men on the point of death. They had neither tents nor wagons, but only some provisions and weapons. Entire families," de Tocqueville went on to write, "died of disease and exposure on the snow-covered trails." So the removal of the Chickasaw was just one of these trails of tears, we could say, before the one you probably remember in 1838 and 1839. The Cherokee would suffer even more than the Chickasaw. One reason we remember the Cherokee so much, and we tend to focus on them. If you ask some people what was the Trail of Tears, they would say it was this one time when the Cherokees were moved out to Oklahoma. And there have been removals going on a lot. And some of these Native Americans are leaving voluntarily. They're not all being, they kind of feel like they're forced. But some of them are choosing to leave, right? The Cherokee could speak English. They could speak English well, and they could write English. They're going to have a Cherokee newspaper, which was mainly English. It was called the Cherokee Phoenix. They understood the United States and the United States system well. This is one reason we remember the Cherokee so much. Only 10% of the Native Americans removed from the Southeast, white Americans called it the Great Southwest then, only 10% was Cherokee. The other Native Americans belonged to these other groups. But the experience of the Cherokee does represent the intense suffering of the Native Americans. Again, we tend to remember them more, and I think you'll see why as we go along. The Cherokee became thoroughly Americanized. The Cherokee were the descendants of those who were part of what was called the Mississippian culture and the mound builders. These Native Americans had seen their numbers over several hundred years dwindle. They had seen whites encroach on their land. But the Cherokee were willing to make many concessions to convince American leaders to respect their rights and to allow them to stay. They lived in eastern Tennessee, northern Alabama, and northern Georgia. Between 1818 and 1829, they became economically self-sufficient and politically self-governing. There were about 15,000 adult Cherokee. They began to think of themselves as not just villages, but a nation. But of course, in this nation, of course, existed in what was inside of states in the United States. 1821 and 22, a Cherokee named Sequoyah devised an 86-character phonetic alphabet. Actually, it was syllables. A Cherokee language Bible was created. A bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which was edited by a Cherokee named Lindneux, who was married to a woman from, I believe it was Connecticut. Not all of these Native Americans were full-blooded Native Americans. One of the most important leaders of the Cherokee, John Ross, was one-eighth Native American. Okay, so we have this bilingual newspaper. There's a good clip on the New Echota historic site. I was going to show this, but I don't think we have time. It lasts about 5 minutes. There's a good clip about the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. And originally, they wanted to have one article like in English and one article in the Cherokee, and that must have been extremely time-consuming. So a lot of the articles were just written in English. They want white Americans and white politicians to read this newspaper. They are pretty savvy. This is something that frustrated American leaders. Okay, they're becoming, quote, civilized in some ways, but these folks are savvy, and there were many American politicians who opposed removal. 97 people in the House voted against it. Henry Clay, Jackson's arch nemesis and Kentucky's most important politician, staunchly opposed Jackson on removal and on everything else. Let's see. Former Attorney General William Wirt opposed it. John Quincy Adams opposed it. So when you say that, you can only judge people in the time period in which they lived, and that's true. You can't place all the values of the present on the past. But yet there were many people in the past who opposed Jackson on this removal policy. The Cherokees created a formal government which had a two-house legislature and a court system. And in 1827, they adopted a written constitution based on what? The United States Constitution. Based on the United States Constitution. But they wrote into that Constitution that we will not sell land. That land is not going to be bought and sold to anybody. They transfer their economy from hunting and gathering to agriculture and to trade based on barter, cash, and credit. This is what the United States wanted them to do. Let's, quote, civilize them over time, and they'll get used to, the ways of capitalism, and eventually they'll sell the land. Well, that's a little more enlightened than what Jackson does, isn't it? Let's see. And they certainly were not all poor. One census showed that the Cherokee owned 33 grist mills, 13 sawmills, 1 powder mill, 69 blacksmith shops, 2 tanneries, 762 looms, 2,400 spinning wheels, 172 wagons, 2,900 plows, 7,600 horses, 22,000 cattle. Some of them had, like John Ross and Major Ridge, had nice homes. You can tour some of those homes if you go to the historic site at New Echota, Georgia, which was the capital of the Cherokee. 46,000 pigs. Okay. That sounds like where I'm from, North Carolina. 46,000 pigs. 2,500 sheep. 2,500 sheep. So that gives you an idea of how they lived and the wealth that they had. Many Cherokee farmed and owned slaves. In 1833, the Cherokee held 1,500 black slaves. 1,500 black slaves. And white Americans would sometimes complain that their slaves were escaping to the Cherokee. They would say that these Native Americans are drinking, they're drinking too much. Eventually, they're not selling their land. They're not selling their land. But yet they had transformed their society, but this transformation did not win failed to win the respect of whites. So, in the 1820s, state officials in Georgia pressed the Cherokee to sell the 7,200 square miles of land that they held in Georgia. I'm sorry, 7,200 square miles that they held in Georgia. Well, the Cherokee didn't want to sell it, so Congress appropriated $30,000, which was a whole lot of money then. But the Cherokee refused to sell this land. Georgia officials grew impatient, so they annulled the Cherokee's constitution. They annulled the Cherokee's constitution. Then said, Georgia now has sovereignty over you. They prohibited the Cherokee National Council from meeting except to discuss ceding land to the United States. And then, in the midst of this struggle with Georgia in 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land. So you just have one step after another that whets the appetites of whites for this land. And some Cherokee were growing tired of this frustrating relationship with the United States and began to conduct negotiations with the United States. Negotiations about leaving. And they were Major Ridge, a Cherokee planter and soldier, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot. So the treaty party was led by Ridge, and Boudinot. Sounds like a law practice. Ridge, and Boudinot. They're conducting negotiations with the United States. But what do you think most Cherokee thought about what these three men were doing? They opposed it. And so this argument now breaks out within Cherokee society. Should we leave? Should we negotiate with the United States? Should we stay here? So, under the leadership of this man, he's 1/8 Cherokee. His name is John Ross, Cherokee Chief John Ross. See his house there? You can see that house at New Echota in North Georgia. It's about an hour and a half north of Atlanta. Ross doesn't want to leave. Ross said he greatly respected the United States system of government. Ross knows Andrew Jackson. And it's Ross who opposes this treaty party, and he, instead of physically fighting the United States, he engineers a lawsuit against the United States. A lawsuit argued by William Wirt, the former Attorney General and a Whig politician of the United States. And the first case was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. And eventually this case went to the Supreme Court. Georgia didn't even send a lawyer to argue it. Georgia said the national government has no right over this case. But Chief Justice John Marshall, a very famous Chief Justice, thought differently. And he ruled that under the Constitution, an Indian tribe was neither a foreign nation nor a state, and therefore had no standing in federal court. But the Indians' relationship with the United States was, quote, marked by cardinal and peculiar distinctions, which exist nowhere else. Legally, Marshall ruled, and Marshall had been an old Federalist. Marshall never adopted Jackson's, political philosophy. Legally, Marshall wrote that the Native Americans with the Cherokee were in, but not of, the United States. The Native Americans, he wrote, had an unquestionable right to their land. They could lose the title to their land only by voluntarily giving it up. So even though this decision was somewhat murky, what does all this cardinal and peculiar distinctions? He called them domestic dependent nations. Well, what does all that mean? I should point out that the Cherokee did concede that they were under the protection of the United States. They did concede that. They were used to having an Indian agent from the federal government in their midst. they were used to having missionaries in their midst, and they submitted to all of this. The Cherokee Phoenix was sometimes used to print parts of the Bible in an attempt to Christianize Native Americans. But later, Marshall is going to rule that to place yourself under the protection of someone is, I forgot the exact wording, is not to allow yourself to be completely dominated by them. Protection does not mean extinction, right? And in another case, Worcester versus Georgia, a year after Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Worcester was a family of missionaries who lived in North Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. Marshall defined the Cherokee position more clearly. He wrote that the Indian Nation was a distinct political community in which, quote, the laws of Georgia can have no force. The laws of Georgia can have no force. And into which Georgians could not enter without treaty privilege or permission. So in this second case, the Worcester case, Marshall was much more clear. And the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix called this, quote, glorious news. Jackson was not so thrilled. Jackson supposedly said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Actually, he probably didn't talk like that. Jackson was born in 1767, but his family had come here from Ireland. His father was Irish, and people noted that he spoke with an Irish brogue, even as an adult, a hint of an Irish brogue. And his father, who was poor and unknown, went to the Carolina frontier where they eked out a difficult living and died. He was buried like a day or two before Jackson was born. So Jackson actually spoke with a little bit of Irish accent. Georgia officials refused to respect Cherokee rights. They were not going to tolerate a sovereign Cherokee nation within their borders. In 1832, John Ridge said, you asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state. We did so, adopting your own as a model. You asked us to cultivate the earth and learn the mechanic arts. We did so. You asked us to learn to read. We did so. You asked us to cast away our idols and worship your God, accept Christianity. We did so. And all of these changes, failed to convince many whites in the South, certainly not all of them, but convince many whites in the South, to leave these Native Americans alone. 1831-32, the Choctaws made the forced journey from Mississippi to Alabama, and Mississippi and Alabama to the west in the wintertime. 1836, the Creeks in Alabama, after resisting removal, were pushed westward. 1837, the Chickasaw followed. So the Trail of Tears, one of those last ones in which a lot of them died, that was not the only Trail of Tears, right? So the Cherokee were divided. They asked, was further resistance hopeless? Should we continue to try, or should we continue to try to negotiate? Can we salvage our way of life and our civilization? The leader of the faction that regarded further resistance as futile agreed to sign a treaty with the United States government, a treaty that most of the Cherokee rejected. 300 Cherokee met U.S. officials at New Echota, Georgia, and they signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to exchange their home in the South for land in the West. None of these Cherokees were elected officials of the Cherokee Nation at New Echota. None of them had been elected. John Ross opposes this treaty. The treaty was signed ceding all Cherokee territory east of the Mississippi to the United States in exchange for $5 million and a new homeland in Indian territory west of the Mississippi. But it really wasn't $5 million. There were some provisions for Native American education, and that was taken out of the $5 million. Native American debts would be taken out of the $5 million, which was a ton of money then, that is true. But they didn't get the entire $5 million. And keep in mind, that this is a minority of Cherokees who support this treaty. John Ross opposes it and wants to stop it. Thousands of Cherokee protested this treaty. And a president has the constitutional power to make a treaty with another country, but what has to approve all treaties? Which house of Congress has to approve all treaties? The Senate, right? And so Ross goes to Washington and meets with Jackson. He even goes to a play in Baltimore with Jackson. So they know each other. They know each other well. These societies are definitely not completely different. They're intelligible societies. As I said, the Cherokee could handle English well. There were some Cherokee married to white American citizens like Boudinot. And they, I think they think that they can reason with the United States. So Ross goes to Washington, and the Cherokee are working with Henry Clay almost up to the moment that the treaty was finally ratified. Clay, when he was in the presidential cabinet, said the destruction of the Native Americans would be no great loss to the human race. But evidently he had changed his mind because he opposed Indian removal. One reason he opposed it is he really despised each other, and he was, if Jackson was for it, he was against it. They were working with Clay. Clay must have had some change of heart after making that awful statement. But even Clay couldn't stop this. Ross lobbied the U.S. Senate against ratification of the treaty. He had a petition with him with 15,000 names on it, but he lost. The treaty was ratified in 1836. And it was ratified by one vote. It was ratified by one vote. It did say the government would give $5 million. The Cherokee had several years to prepare to remove. But again, the treaty had been negotiated by a minority of Cherokee. Jackson left office in 1837, and his successor was his right-hand man from New York, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren had helped to unite the Northern and Southern Democratic parties to help get Jackson elected. He would have a rough time as president. His enemies called him Van, the used-up man. But it was Van Buren who helped to unite the Northern and Southern Democratic parties to help get Jackson elected. Jacksonian democracy was not simply a Southern phenomenon. You might want to go to a website that's called, Brent, what's that American, shows the maps, American Presidency Project. That's it. Do you use that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure, but there's a website called the American Presidency Project. You can get all this great information about the presidents, and you can find some primary sources. You can also find every map for every single presidential election in American history. And once you get, now the first few elections don't have the exact numbers, but most of the elections have the exact number of votes that these candidates got. And they have a map with the different colors on it. You know, you can see like how many votes Abraham Lincoln got in Kentucky in 1860. Lincoln got only 0.9% of the vote in Kentucky. So you can see the exact number of votes that he got. It's called the American Presidency Project. And if you look at the election of 28 and 32, you can see that Jackson wins more than the South. He won in 32. He would win New York. He would win Pennsylvania. Van Buren believed that parties were good. You know, sometimes people turn up their nose, say, political parties, we're all at each other's throats. Van Buren thought they were a good part of the political system. And he is the one who inherits this controversy with the Native Americans, many of whom do not want to move. And eventually, U.S. troops will evict the Cherokee from their homes and hold them in detention camps. Some of the Cherokee have already left, thinking it was fruitless to struggle on. But they were held in detention camps and marched under military escort to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. I've heard the numbers 16,000, 17,000. I've heard the numbers 20,000. This is the Trail of Tears that most people remember. approximately 1/4 of these Native Americans died. And here is probably the most famous painting, Robert Lindneux, which was painted long after the actual removal. We don't have any, contemporary pictures that were painted of the removal. And of course, you see small children. It's in the dead of winter. Here you see troops. Here you see troops here. Men, women, children. Here you see children. I read what a couple of soldiers said long after this removal. They said, one guy said, "I served in the Civil War and I saw some terrible things, but the worst thing I saw was this Indian removal. That's the worst thing I saw." And there were many who died and got sick. There were some who were ran off. There were some that were shot by U.S. troops. And see you shaking your head, so you know something about this. I tell my students that the United States has had enormous achievements, and this is not one of them. This is definitely not one of them. Like I said, this is a trail of tears that we tend to remember. Here you see, this is kind of a little confusing, but here you see this northern route from northern Georgia to Nashville through Hopkinsville. Have you been to the Trail of Tears Park? There are several Native American leaders buried there, right? Okay, two chiefs. I still have to go there.
It's neat. There's two
Okay.
chiefs they died on the trail, and finally a farmer gave them some land to bury them. And so
Okay.
that's where the park is now.
Okay, I still have to go there. Kentucky has so many cool history sites. And then this goes up into southern Illinois and then cuts back down into Arkansas and then to the Oklahoma Territory. And here you can see, a little confusing, but you can see some of the other routes also. Many of these Native Americans were forced, as I said, only 10% was Cherokee. Some left, under pressure, giving up, but they were not necessarily removed. But many of them were forced out. What was the balance sheet of removal? 100 million acres east of the Mississippi River, 100 million acres east of the Mississippi River was traded for 32 million acres west of it. 100 million acres to the east, 32 to the west. And do you think that land in the west was nearly as good as the land in the east? No, right? No. The United States doled out $68 million, which was a tremendous amount of money. But that doesn't make up for what's happening. A few scattered remnants of Indians remained east of the Mississippi River, such as the Cherokee in the southern Appalachians, and then the Seminole in Florida. And the United States, earlier the United States had been embroiled in a brutal war in Florida against the Seminole Indians, and Jackson fought down there. So removal took a huge toll, 100 million acres for 32 million acres. This was an alien environment, obviously, to these Native Americans who were moved west of the Mississippi River. Violence broke out among them. In 1839, the followers of John Ross assassinated the pro-treaty faction, the faction that was led by Ridge, and Boudinot. They were all beheaded. I don't know if Ross has ever been linked to it, but the followers of Ross killed these men who were willing to negotiate with the United States. And so this difficult chapter, yeah.
That was also aggravated by their stand in the Civil War, where John Ross sided with the full-blooded, and the other side sided with the mixed-blooded, which kept their slaves.
All right. Okay. Good.
So that was part of the aggravation.
Okay. Part of their siding with the Civil War. Okay. I had a professor in school who wrote a book on. It was called Cherokee Chief. Last name was Thomas, I think. But thanks for that comment. So it's some fallout from the Civil War. Okay. So this difficult chapter, well, it never really came to an end because the impact on the Native Americans would be, so difficult. There's no doubt that this today besmirches Jackson's reputation. But man, when he was, a lot of white Southerners were really thrilled by this. Now all this land is opened up, and they sold some of the land by lottery, and Jackson himself bought some of the land and established plantations on this land. Jackson thought, at least he said, as you remember that quote I showed you at the beginning, that he had done the right thing, that these Native American tribes are going to be destroyed. His most important biographer says that Jackson, this was a plan that had the best of intentions. Others have argued that's being far too lenient on Jackson. Paul Pruka, who's also written a lot about Indian and U.S. relations, said that this was a much more difficult decision than it looked like. I'm not defending it, I'm just giving you ideas. That what were they going to do? Genocide. Well, this was the beginning of genocide, but Jackson could not have contemplated actually just killing all of them. Sort of like a 20th century genocide. That wouldn't have been honorable. You just moved them from their home. Let's see. What about making them citizens? I don't know. I think a lot of Cherokee who didn't want to become U.S. citizens. I think there were some who did. But of course, the Whigs, like Henry Clay and his opponents, might say, "Why can't we just go on like we are? Can't we gradually integrate these Native Americans into American life?" And so, that was a possibility. But Pruka argues that there were really no truly good options for Jackson. I'm not defending him. I'm just presenting this information. Others say that's being far too generous with Jackson. This is a political cartoon from 1886. Of course, this is 50 years after the removal, but you know that the harassment of the Cherokee would continue. Here you see lands in Alabama and Arkansas. Here you see railroads written on the foot of the Native American. Court decisions, even though the court decisions helped in the 1830s, later they would not. And this, what famous novel does this draw its inspiration from? Okay, Gulliver's Travels with the Lilliputians, So, of course, the difficulties for the Cherokee and others will continue. And if you act like that, you might lose your place on the $20 bill. You'll lose your place on the $20 bill if you act like this. Jackson thought he had acted honorably. The Native Americans didn't, for sure. And today, later generations have serious questions about the moral aspects of Native American removal.